to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is globalization responses from developed societies. Dear learners, in the lecture we shall discuss various dimensions in which globalization has affected states with the special focus on the developed societies. We shall conclude by looking at the impact of globalization on developed societies, what are the points of debates with respect to globalization in developed societies and the way forward for the future. In the lecture, we shall try to analyze also the relationship between globalization and developed societies, looking at the bigger picture of how this has an impact when we look at developed societies for global world governance, and above all looking at the aspect of economic ties, development, and how important they are when we look at the global and economic international governance. At the outset, let us understand what do we mean by globalization. We all know that globalization is an important topic in the discipline of international relations, political science, international political economy, international business, micro and macro economics. Globalization has been an important aspect with respect to the study of world history. But for the purpose of our lecture, we shall try to look at globalization in the contemporary context, namely globalization. By that we define it as process of interaction and integration amongst the people, governments of different nations. When we talk about globalization, one has to also look at that in the present times, what are the drivers of globalization? In the present time, globalization is driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. Then when we are discussing globalization, one has to see that it is multidimensional in nature, namely it has an impact on environment, ecology. When we look at the concerns of climate change, it has an impact on the culture when we have the concerns of standardization, homogenization, or the bigger debate on westernization. It impacts political system, economic development, human physical well-being all over the globe. However, for the purpose of our lecture, we shall try to understand these debates with focus on the developed societies. Globalization, as pointed out, that it has been a point of argument with respect to world history, and that has a bearing on respective histories of nation states also. It is argued that globalization existed earlier also, but when we look at the present time, both as an ideology and process, globalization has become dominant political, economic, cultural force in the 21st century. Globalization has impacted every corner of the world, and this is why when we see that how the roles of states are under transition, how there is a big questions that are raised with respect to economy and its global interface in a significant manner, both within developed and developing societies. Globalization, when we take some important definition from the World Bank, the World Bank defines globalization as freedom and ability of individuals and firms to initiate voluntary economic transactions with residents of other countries. So therefore, related to this definition, another definition that we read from online search, that is, globalization signifies deepening of economic ties worldwide resulting from intensified cross-border movement of capital and labor force, increased transactions of commodities and services through trade, and expanded overseas investment. When we try to understand globalization, we have to see that it is a controversial topic. Namely, it has advantages as well as it has disadvantages. From the positive sides, today there are arguments that it has led to increasing economic growth, free flow of ideas, created new jobs and economic growth through cross-border flow of goods, capital, labor. Many initiatives today, when we look in the realm of health, example robotics, when we look in the realm of education, namely digitalization, when we look at the realm of technology, namely rise of rampant instant communicative realms, they're all direct results of globalization. However, contrast with that, there are disadvantages also, that is interference by dominance power, spread of new diseases, for example pandemics, how a virus that emerges in one part of the globe all of a sudden in no certain time spreads across the globe. Lack of capabilities, differentiated capabilities, namely an economic inequality. In the lecture, as we trace the impact of globalization on developed countries, developed societies, let us first understand how do we define the developed societies. One criteria is income per capita. That is, dear learners, countries with high gross domestic product per capita, they are described as developed countries. Another criteria, they have advanced technological and infrastructure aspects, and they have diverse industrial and service sector. Now, traditional developed country markets, which we shall use as case studies to understand the impact of globalization on developed societies, is they are example USA, Europe, Japan, and they are also collectively known as Global North. Globalization, the increasing integration of world markets. We take reference to this very important article that came in the Forbes magazine 2017, that is, globalization has done a lot of great things for Americans. The argument that the article makes, that is, globalization, the process of increasing integration of world markets, has been a great boon, great use for United States of America. It has done great things for America, because when we try to understand globalization, it has a specific historical context, namely the end of the Cold War. Cold War was a period of ideological war between two superpowers of the world, USA and USSR. The globalization in the post-Cold War era signifies the defeat of communism. It portrays the American win over war on communism, as this article also points out. As the article points out, that it gave Americans the freedom from government regulations and militant unions. It assigned America the role of world's best innovator, and above all, the forces of globalization helped America sustain its lead as the world's largest economy. Related to it, dear learners, when we are looking at the case study of USA with respect to the responses from developed side, we take reference to this very important book by Alfred A. Ickes, Thomas B. Zahler, Globalization and the American Century, Cambridge University Press, 2003. Now, this book with respect to contextualizing USA from the historical perspective. For example, USA emerging from the Spanish-American War, the country being somewhere victorious in the First World War, leading the world governance after the Second World War, winning the Cold War. So herein, when we look at that, how improvements in technology, deregulation of market, as this book argues, the free trade, it gave impetus, it fueled the American style globalization, and how this American style globalization as a power tool was an example of America's progress, prowess, power and cultural influence, which also soared as the business, the financial interest, they pursued the long-term quest for the global markets. But again, as the book also points out, that when we look at September 2001, when we look at the bigger picture of volatility of global finance, it raises question about whether the American-led globalization, whether was it good or not. And above all, the question that is also being raised even today, that whether this globalization from the developed countries, whether it is sustainable or not. As we are trying to look at the American case study, an important book that is by Edward Goldberg, that is Why Globalization Works for America. This book is from University of Nebraska Press 2020, and this book points out that when we look at blue collar jobs issue, the loss of jobs, the bigger picture of immigration, and the issues that how immigration somewhere led to a lot of problems for the natives, the question of trade deficits. There is a debate in USA as well as in many developed societies, that is, we blame globalization for the host of problems. The argument that this book points out here is that we also cannot ignore that how political system is also split between this ideological differences in the developed societies with respect to the populists and the progressives. So herefore what we see that the argument that the book is making, which we must deliberate while as we track the responses to globalization from developed societies, that is, natural processes globalization as a process, it has pushed people into more efficient behavior influenced by market and above all our human need to explore, to exchange and to grow. What is needed, as the book argues, and we leave it up to you all to research, to deliberate further on it, is that there is a need to have a relook at nationalist policies that have arisen because there are concerns, and these concerns are valid and also cannot be ignored. That is, today the natives, the Americans, do not share globalization's benefits equally, and this situation, as the book argues, it has been problematized further by government's refusal to implement policies that would mitigate rampant inequalities. Another case study that we take in the lecture to track down that what has been the responses from developed societies with respect to globalization, we take some insights from Japan. Now, when we look at Japan, as an island nation with special focus on its economy, its exchange rate has changed substantially, and this also impacts the Japanese economy. There has been advancement of Japan's industrial and trade structures. USA is an important trading partner for Japan, but at the same time, it has also diversified its business, commercial and other diplomatic ties towards the East Asian region also. So, as we read from this very important web resource, that is cao.go.jp, that is Japanese economy, when we look at a comparative as well as on a contrasting note, its international ties are not as deep as those of when we look at other developed societies and countries like the European countries or the North American countries. An important book to elaborate further on the Japanese case study with respect to responses from globalization with insights towards the domestic structure, we take reference to this book by Matoshi Suzuki, Globalization and the Politics of Institutional Reform in Japan, 2016. Now, Globalization and Politics of Institutional Reform in Japan, this book highlights, it narrates that Japan's contemporary as well as historical struggles, Japan's challenging institutional, political, bureaucratic changes and transformation that came forward since the Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century, and how above all adjusting policy and the institutional architecture of government to an evolving global order. The analysis as the book presents, and we take some important points for us to elaborate further in our research, in our arguments and in our answers also, that the big question on the structural tendency towards central political command, and the argument that is, as the book argues, that how there must be a plurality in order to develop a comprehensive outlook to deal with globalization, namely that for a globalizing state to incorporate opposition, the transgovernmental networks into policy making processes, and how this plural comprehensive dialogue can work to the advantage for holistic expression of national interest. Dear learners, as we are trying to understand globalization and developed society's response, a very significant dimension of contemporary globalization alongside economic ties has been the technological perspective. Globalization in recent years has been influenced by technological innovations in the areas of communication, including information processing via computers, World Wide Web, Internet, new forms of communication, rise of social media, amongst others. In this regard, it is also very essential to see that how the world is drawing a transition with respect to its economic models, with respect to its informatory aspects also. Today we are seeing that there is rise of Industry 4.0. Today the world is being defined by the digital aspect, and above all it's an information age. In this aspect also, developed societies have an important bearing. For example, when we look at the contemporary trade war issues, how technology forms an important aspect of power that developed societies like United States try to factor in. Another case study as we try to understand globalization with respect to the trade-offs also comes from the European Union. We all know that globalization presents benefits as well as opportunities. When we look at Europe as a case study, and again we get this perspective from ec.europa.eu, very significant insights that we get, that is, Europe has faced increased competition in all traded goods and services. When we look at EU firms, no doubt one cannot ignore that they receive easier access to new and expanding markets, and above all sources of finance and technology, and related to it that how even EU consumers have access to a larger variety of goods at lower process. Issues at hand because of which there is an anger within the developed societies, within the citizenry and society with respect to approaching globalization. And as the this web source ec.europa.eu also points out, that issues like job losses, downward pressures on wages and working condition, how all of it has an impact on the people in developed societies. The widespread use of information technologies also somewhere it erodes the boundaries between what can and what cannot be traded. So therefore what is needed is one has to find an adequate response to globalization and turn its potential benefits into real gains. What is needed is to successively cope with structural economic change. One has to also at the same time work to minimize the social cost. An important policy prescription as the ec.europa.eu makes, and we read, European Union needs to adjust in a way where factors of production such as capital move away from activities and firms that can't withstand the increased competitive pressure to those that can thrive on it. An important aspect that is when we are trying to look at the bigger picture with respect to how globalization needs to be worked. We take reference to this big, very important publication by Ian Golden, Kenneth Renath, Globalization for Development, Trade, Finance, Aid, Migration and Policy. Dear learners, this is the World Bank publication in 2007. This book identifies the big historical trends, namely when we look at global flows, trade issues, finance, trends in foreign aid, migration and ideas. This book presents a very important policy recommendation, which is to make globalization an effective means as a vehicle for shared growth and prosperity. Above all, how this book presents the argument that globalization, which has been always seen as something which has led to poverty, the book argues that how the countries of the world can get together to work globalization in a manner which can be used to get in shared growth and prosperity. So, dear learners, as we try to understand responses of developed societies with reference to the process of globalization, once again we have to see that globalization today is a very important topic. And within this important topic, when we hear about the big concerns of deglobalization, when we hear about countries saying let's cut off free trade ties, this integration of world markets, no doubt it was led by the developed world. Developing countries also face problems, but at the same time one cannot ignore the concerns of the voices that are there from developed societies. No doubt globalization led to huge amount of advantages, namely ushering economic growth, new forms of ideas, technology, new innovations in health, economy, education, technology, wherein developed societies have been the harbingers of change which are a direct result of globalization. However, at the same time, one cannot look at that how with respect of issues of inequity, issues of sustainability, issues of need to have ecological balance, need to have a united front against pandemics, even with the rise of new forms of security threats ranging from pandemics to international terrorism, countries from the developed societies have raised a voice. So, what is essential here is that one must look at the responses from the developed societies in a manner that one must look at diversity. For example, concerns of Japan will be different with respect to concerns of the countries coming up from European Union on the bigger question whether globalization is sustainable or not, whether globalization was good or not. What is essential here is that within this perspectives of diversities, one must try to look at the common aspects of gains and losses, and nations must work to mitigate the losses, mitigate the inequalities and work out avenues to maximize the gains in order to present a world governance scenario where there is sustainability, where there are benefits of technology, wherein there are benefits of shared growth, shared prosperity, economic gains amongst others. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture Globalization responses from developed societies gave you significant insights to reflect, to add further, to add to your answers and to use for your research and analysis also. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much for being with us for the lecture.